All right, we are back. It's another week of good vibes. I'm Martin False, and joining me now, Debbie Cox DeNova. Very important show today because we've all dealt with grief over some parts of our lifetime. So today we're going to talk about processing grief. And Debbie, that's a very important subject.
It is. And a lot of this information comes from Sky Jarrett, who's a mindfulness coach. And it's important to remember that when we're talking about grief, we're not necessarily just talking about the loss of someone to death, but we grieve all sorts of things throughout our life. And the universal law of impermanence says that we are going to, whatever we love, we're going to lose, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's almost like this inevitable suffering that comes with being human. It doesn't necessarily mean just because you're losing people, but like you can lose a vision that you had in your heart. You can lose a job. You can lose a relationship. I actually coach a lot of people who are in the grieving process of relationship. And it's really important as we talk about how to mindfully grieve in a way that actually reduces suffering, that you know that you can apply this to any kind of grief that you're experiencing, and that you get to apply this so that you can have a dignified experience of grieving. Because a lot of people are lost in loneliness, shame, guilt about the grieving process.
Right.
So, okay.
And so, like when my dad died, of course you grieve.
Yeah.
But then I started replacing it with good thoughts about that made me laugh.
Yeah.
Took a while, but once you replace it, when you start to grieve, you just smile.
Yeah. Yes.
Think of the good things, and it will get you past it.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that because we're going to talk about some mindful shifts. Then that is one of them, actually staying connected to the person that you lost, right? And, it's important to, and so there are several mindset shifts that you can apply, and also knowing a formula that will change everything about the grieving process. So the father of mindfulness is Thich Nhat Hanh, and he says that if we can learn to suffer, we will suffer much less. So today we're going to talk about how to suffer, learning how to suffer in a way that is going to actually produce joy in the grieving process. And those two things can actually live side by side. So it's important to kind of give yourself permission to feel the joy when the joy comes up and not to feel guilty about it. If you're taking a long time grieving, to know that there's no expiration on grief. It goes on, it comes in waves. It's been said that you can't stop the waves from coming, but you can learn how to surf. So that's what we're doing today, okay?
Yeah, I tell people that tell me that they just lost a parent or brother or sister. I never tell them I know how you feel because we all feel differently. But what I tell them is there's not going to be a day that goes by that you don't think of them. Yeah. But I said soon the sorrow will be replaced. You'll start laughing, remembering something they said, or remembering joy, and sort of takes over.
Yeah, it does. It does it in the best of it. And so that's really great that you've had. I had the same experience with my brother Bobby. They say that you go through 5 stages of grief. So the first one is denial, and that's where you're really trying to protect yourself, insulate yourself from the experience because it's a lot, losing someone. Anger is the next one, and there, again, that is a protective emotion. So it's sort of like there's a resentment process that happens. It's a secondary emotion that kind of covers that more vulnerable stuff. Then there's bargaining, and bargaining is where you're trying to regain that control. Maybe you're praying, to bring back something that is just completely lost to you, right? And then you have depression. So there's kind of a sadness that takes over. But this is really important because then you're starting to process the grief, right? In that depression, that sadness, you kind of remove yourself. And then there's acceptance. And in acceptance is when you really start to, it's not that you're over it, because you may never, ever, ever you'll never be over it, right? If there's a grief. But it's sort of a coming to terms with that this is the new reality and this is how we're moving forward. But some of the mind shifts that may be super helpful is, number one, that we don't only experience grief through the loss of people, that it can be jobs, it can be all sorts of things. And when you're losing something in life and you're experiencing grief, it's really important that you apply these principles no matter what it is, okay? And not feel guilty about it. Number two is that you can experience joy and grace in the midst of grief. So it's a very complex process. For some people, there's a lot of laughter that's involved in remembering the memories and all of that. For other people, it goes straight into that lower vibration stuff. And that's okay. Okay. But to recognize that as you apply these principles, you can actually experience a great deal of value and joy in the grieving process. Number 3 is the recognition that grief is a full body process. So there's a reason that you feel tired. You might feel aches and pains. You might feel, so these phantom things. It's a lot on the physical body to go through grief. And number 4 is really realizing that you don't need to apologize for your grief. There is no expiration date on it. It may take you a long time to get through something that other people don't seem to be, taking as long with.
Right.
And then what a lot of people experience is that they start isolating from their community because it's like, well, nobody understands. No one's lost their mother like I have in my community. And so then you isolate, which makes it much worse. And then the 5th one is that it doesn't have an expiration date. It's not a problem to get over. It's not something that needs to be solved. It's going to be a process, and you can go through that process. And we're going to talk about, after the break, a formula that is going to shift everything. And Sky Jarrett says, if you remember nothing else about the grieving process, this formula is very important because it's going to reduce the suffering. The grief, the pain of losing someone will always be there. But the degree to which you suffer is actually within your control. And so we can actually take it from, if you can imagine grief as a teaspoon of salt. You put that teaspoon of salt in a cup of water, that water is not going to be very pleasant, right? It's going to be pretty potent and strong. But it's like taking that teaspoon and putting it into a pond of water. It loses its power over your life, and you can actually experience joy in the midst of all of that.
There you go. All right. So we will be back. Great topic. And it's called Processing Grief, Part 2, coming up. Today's social media segment is brought to you by South Louisiana Bank. It's better when we bank together. Waits and Downer, attorneys at law. Terrebonne Ford, built Ford tough. Alford and Associates, for all of your insurance needs. CIS, Cardiovascular Institute of the South, the highest quality cardiovascular care available. Barker Honda, the Barker family tradition of quality. Terrebonne General Health Systems, modern technology and timeless caring. Rouse's, you're either local or you're not. Buick, the craft of modern luxury. St. Martin and Bork, know your rights. All right, we are back. Good vibes time. Martin Falls with Debbie Cox DeNova. We're talking about processing grief and trying to get past grief. And I was talking a lot. I'm a big believer in signs. And some people say, oh, there's no signs. How can I give you signs? Well, if you're closed-minded, you'll never get one.
Right.
I can promise you that. But after Dad died, I was getting all kind of signs and different things. But you have to be open to them.
Yeah.
And even if it's coincidental, it still works pretty good.
It does, absolutely. And I agree with you. The same thing with my brother Bobby. So many signs. And I was open to it and looking for it. And it was a way for me to stay connected to him, even though he wasn't physically here. So it's important that you can actually do that. And even if you don't, if you're not a signs person, creating rituals, for example, if you want to continue to celebrate their birthday or something that they really loved, and actually keeping it on the calendar every year so that you're keeping the memory of them alive, but you're connecting to them in a completely different way is really, really important. So I love that you brought that up because for a lot of people, it gives a lot of comfort signs. It feels like, okay, I can still communicate. And I do. I communicate to my brother all the time. And I feel like he communicates back very, very fast. And it's very difficult to explain that to anyone else unless you're experiencing it personally. But it gives me a great deal of comfort. And it feels like a new connection, different from what we had before, but actually even more expanded, right? Because I have him wherever I go. Now, there's a formula called the suffering formula that Sky Jarrett talks about. And the suffering formula is this: suffering equals pain times resistance. Suffering equals pain times resistance. So the pain of grief is going to be with you, and it'll ride, like we said, in waves. But the degree to which you suffer is within your control, and it's a matter of how much resistance you apply to that pain. So the more that you resist, that resistance becomes an amplifier, which creates more suffering. And the antidote to that is acceptance. Now, we're not talking about apathy. We're not coming to a place where it's like, well, I don't care anymore that they passed away. It's coming to full terms with, okay, they're not here anymore. They're gone. Or if some people are experiencing pre-grief, right? So it's like they haven't lost someone yet, but they're trying to come to terms with, I'm losing them. They're actually going to pass away. And so being able to actually come to terms with, okay, yes, I accept that they have gone, or I accept that they are going, actually gives way for you to actually experience joy and presence if the person is still here. And it's also important to remember that when you're grieving a relationship, what you're often grieving, I'll ask clients sometimes, I'm like, if you had somebody who actually checked all of your boxes, including the ones that this person that you just lost didn't check, would you be grieving as much? And the answer is always no. I would be fine immediately, right? And that's because, so what we recognize is that what you're grieving is the version of you that came up. We talked about that before within the space of that relationship. It feels like if I don't have this person, then I will no longer be feeling attractive or respected or whatever came up as a result of it. And so being able to preserve that connection with that version of yourself is really important. It actually is something that can help you move forward.
Yeah, we lose our habitual ways of thinking. We're all creatures of habit.
For sure.
Once the habit's broken, we all go, oh no, then you realize, well, wasn't that bad after all.
Yeah, exactly. There is a gap, there is a gap, especially if you're talking about somebody who is actually, that you're actually losing for good. They're not on the planet anymore. It's like there's a hole in your life, right? So you need to also create systems of refuge for yourself. You need to know that on the good days, you're gonna feel good, and it's okay and very good for you to actually celebrate their life and feel joy and laughter. On the days that you're having a hard time, though, you need to know exactly who I go to. Who can I talk to? Because grief is better experienced in community. Talking to people who actually will listen and are interested in you talking about the life of the person that you lost or whatever it is that you lost. So knowing exactly who you're going to talk to, what safe spaces you can go to so that you can process the grief. It's really important. A lot of people are avoiding their grief, or they've said, all right, it's enough time. Nobody wants to hear this anymore. And they're avoiding it. And then when you avoid grief, it will crop up in a different way and start to destroy. This is true for relationships. If you're still grieving someone that you lost and you're trying to go into a new relationship, that grief will deteriorate. Like, will actually start to corrode your current relationship.
Yeah, because she sure don't want to hear my stories. And on the other side, the man doesn't want to hear her stories.
Right, for sure, exactly. So processing through that grief is really important in relationships, but also for someone that you've lost. You may have good days, and it may be years, and then you have a bad day. You need to know exactly where you can go to process that grief responsibly. Give yourself the dignity of that. So know that the more that you loved someone or something, the more grief that is going to be there. The longer the process may take, and that's okay. All right. And then also to remember that you don't have to lose connection with them. Like you said, there can be different ways that you actually ceremoniously create for yourself reconnection to them in a different way. And it can be signs, it can be celebrations, it can be, you're just talking about them periodically, that to keep that alive and that connection with you. It's just going to change.
I find if you're really close to someone, or if you have a good relationship with your daddy, your mom, or your brother, in your case, that when you get around things that y'all did together, the connection is palatable.
Yeah.
You can feel it.
For sure. Yeah. And it's beautiful. And actually, there are gifts within the process of that. So just remember, too, that your belief in yourself and your capacity to heal and get through this is really important. If you believe that you can get through something, even if it feels like a level 10 of heaviness, that you can actually get through it. And then become the pond. Become the pond through acceptance, actually accepting, okay, this grieving process is what it is, and I'm actually not going to apply my resistance to it and make myself suffer. I'm actually going to let myself be in it, and when I'm in it, I'm going to breathe through it and just ride the waves of grief so that I can get to the other side and it can actually become a beautiful experience for me.
Great show. Great topic.
Thank you.
Processing grief. Hey, you hear? Hey, pass this on to somebody that you know that might be going through grief. They might get a lot out of it. We'll see you again next week.